black bar stays green. You may not have access to the mic, but you can always use the chat box to comment, ask questions, and in fact, we encourage you to do so all through the webinar. If you have technical difficulties, please write into the chat box and we will try to help, although often it is rather the internet connection that fails us, and unfortunately, we cannot do anything about that. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Kristen Hope, who will moderate this discussion and who will also introduce the speaker and the topic.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, this is Kristen. It's such a pleasure to be here virtually with you all today, and thank you so much for making time to join us. So before we start, I just wanted to give a very brief introduction. So my name is Kristen Hope, and I work with Terre des Hommes in our Access to Justice program as the advocacy and research coordinator. For some of you who don't know Terre des Hommes, you can look in the bottom middle part of your screen, and there's a link to, it says TDH Juvenile Justice, and that's a link to our juvenile justice page on our website. And there you can learn a little bit more about the types of activities and approaches that we foster across the world. Currently, our juvenile justice program is up and running in almost 20 countries worldwide, and that includes direct intervention with children in contact with the law, either as victims or offenders, but also we do a lot of work in terms of system strengthening and also advocacy at national and international levels. So please feel free to explore a little bit further using that link. The second point that I wanted to mention, so really more in line with the topic of today's webinar, is Terre des Hommes in May hosted an international congress, a world congress on justice for children, and the specific title of that congress was Strengthening Justice Systems for Children, Challenges Including Disengagement from Violent Extremism. So this is a topic that we as an organization, alongside other partners, have been really dedicating attention to in the past several years, because it is a very pressing issue, and we think that it merits attention at multiple levels. This is also the reason why we had a partnership with Dr. Erica Harper, who is here today to present her work. And yes, so without further ado, I will pass you on to Erica. Erica is a yes. Do you want me to introduce you, Erica, or do you want to introduce yourself?
I certainly don't want to introduce myself.
Okay, well, so Erica,
we can just start. Thanks, Kristen. Thank you, Kristen, for the introduction, and of course to Child Hub for their facilitation. I'm assuming that everyone can hear me and see me. I'm just going to click on to our first slide. No, okay, I think we're all set. So I'm particularly grateful for any opportunity to discuss radicalization and extremism. As someone who's worked on the topic for many, many years now, it's been pretty incredible to watch just how quickly it's fallen from the agenda since late 2017, when Daesh suffered that significant military defeat. Now, on one hand, this is worrying. Most experts agree that what happened in Iraq that October shouldn't by any means imply that the group is gone. It's been pushed underground, and because the causal drivers remain, whether it's it or something like it will return. And when it does, it will again involve mainly young people, and its results will again be violent. On the other hand, if we want to think more positively and constructively, not having Daesh front and centre has opened up a bit of a space to think about violent extremism more generally, to move away from this rhetoric that this is a Muslim problem or this is a Middle East problem, because it's not. And if we're smart, we'll use this space wisely to better understand why we had fairly limited experience at curbing the phenomenon when it was at its height, and to forge better protection frameworks for young people and children at risk. Okay, so let's see, first slide. Okay, so none of this means that everybody should be running PVE programs. Some agencies have found it quite difficult to engage in a way that doesn't compromise basic principles on the protection of children recruited by militant groups. And certainly sometimes in order to maintain access, the best role to play is that of a neutral and trustworthy stakeholder. But every agency with a youth or a child protection mandate has a stake in this. Of all the generalisations that we tend to make about extremist groups, the one that no one contests is the disproportionate participation of youth and the unspeakable use of children. Now, none of this is really new. Throughout history, young people have always made up the ranks of these movements. This is probably because youth are caught up in this kind of very special moment. They've got the most to gain from positive social change, but they haven't usually accumulated social assets in terms of career or family. So they have relatively less to lose. And they've got agency, often for the first times in their lives. And for children, again, they have always been utilised by militant groups, mainly as pragmatic. They're cheaper to maintain, they're easier to manipulate. A key difference with Daesh has been their strategy. For them, it's not just about efficiency. Breaching international norms on how children are used in theatre has yielded them significant propaganda returns. And their idea was, and still is, to build an empire, a generation of children that have been indoctrinated in violence with no competing influences. So again, while it's not possible or necessary for everyone to engage as a community of practice, it's essential to understand how and why young people and children get caught up in these movements and the risks that they face and how their resilience can be bolstered. And I think that's where it's really at. It's all about resilience. If I had to reduce the most current thinking on this topic to one soundbite, it's that the forces driving extremism are deeply entrenched and they're not going away anytime soon. So if your mandate is protection, how to build resilience against these forces needs to be at the fore, and it probably needs to start now. Okay, so rather than jumping straight into how we do this, we need to be able to answer this burning question of what goes into the making of a violent extremist. The importance of this cannot be stated strongly enough. Policymakers getting this wrong largely explains why interventions to date have been limited in their effectiveness, or in some cases counterproductive. So how I'm going to do this, and I hope it's not going to seem too much like school, is I'm going to recap how the policy community generally understands this radicalisation extremism process, and then I'll move on to what a more evidence-based conceptualisation might look like. And then hopefully it'll become clear why some policies and programs have little chance of working and what more effective ones might look like. Okay, so when Daesh was at its strongest, it had around 30,000 foreign fighters from around 81 countries. And perhaps what was most puzzling was that apart from being disproportionately young and male, there was strong heterogeneity in fighter profiles. So ethnicity, social class, ideology, socioeconomic status, it just couldn't explain participation in an extremist group. And this applied both to participants from the region and foreign fighters. Now, the theory that became most popular is one you've probably heard of, was this idea of push and pull factors. But this has since come under quite a bit of scrutiny. So push-pull factors are just too generic to consistently explain group attachment in individuals. So unemployment, lack of opportunity, political marginalisation, it just affects so many people in contributing countries. So they just don't explain why the majority don't radicalise or behave violently. A second point is that even if a set of drivers could explain radicalisation, radicalization doesn't seem to explain violent extremism. So what we know now is that many individuals subscribe to radical ideology, but never go on to join extremist groups or engage in extremist behavior. And what this means is that the process of developing radical beliefs, it needs to be distinguished from action pathways. Radical ideology, it may not be something that can or even should be prevented. So instead, it's when someone with radical ideas decides to join a violent group, it's this moment that needs to be understood and interrupted. Now, the challenge is that this space, this moment between holding radical ideas and joining a group, it's really difficult to penetrate. It often takes place rapidly, and it always takes place in highly guarded social networks. And then once in theatre, individuals are almost impossible to access. And if they return, their testimony is often unreliable. Okay, so where does this leave us? The evidence tells us that there's no single set of motivations driving individuals to join extremist groups. It's a complex, it's a relational process, it's not linear, and the pathways are really hard to predict. This is a really unhelpful place to be from a policy and a programming perspective. And it's probably because this reality is so unhelpful that we've clung on to these flawed theories like push and pull. But look, let's for a moment just forget everything that has been heard or read about radicalization pathways or push and pull. And I'll put forward some new ideas that might make a bit more sense. And the basic proposition, you can see it in front of you, it consists of two parts. So first, individuals join a violent extremist group because of structural motivators, they're rejecting or they're rebelling against a situation, or because of individual incentives, highly personal returns. And then second, they meet enabling conditions. The ideology and opportunity presented by groups like Daesh, it provides them with a context within which to address their needs. I'm going to take a few minutes to go through this in a bit more detail because it's so critical. If we don't get this, we just can't craft effective interventions. And as soon as I'm done with that, we're going to pause for some questions. Okay, we'll start with structural motivators. A first group of individuals are motivated to join a violent extremist group by their desire to right or avenge injustices committed against the group that they identify with. So in the Daesh context, these identity politics center around this notion of Sunni marginalization and oppression. But who the other is, who's the bad guy, it takes several forms. So the first other against who the Sunnis identify is the US, or the West more broadly. And we all know the basis for this, post-World War I interventions in Arab affairs, Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands, US invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. Okay, the second other is the Shia, who Sunnis identify as the antagonist in their weakened political influence and territorial integrity. And a final other evolved with Assad's brutality against his own Syrian, predominantly Sunni Muslim population. So many of the returnee fighters that have been interviewed, they joined either al-Nusra or Daesh simply to defend Syrian women and children against regime attacks. Now, how these identity politics motivate people to join an extremist group, it's not exclusive to Daesh. We see it happening in other extreme right-wing movements and in gangs. But it's basically a narrowing of self-identity. It's me against the other. And then these rifts and tensions, they get exploited by the group's propaganda that validates the individual's perception of their marginalization. So what they're saying is, yes, your feelings are justified, but not only that, you can do something about it by joining us. Now, Daesh was highly effective at portraying itself as this group fighting to avenge these decades-long injustices and the only political group capable or willing to protect Sunni interests in the region. And they coloured this with highly evocative media. So footage of civilians killed by US drones, Shia militias in Iraq, and so many images of dead Syrian children. But then what about the recruits that weren't Sunni, or they didn't care much about Middle East politics? Well, there's another form of inter-identity politics that plays out between individuals and the state. In developing and developed countries, we see unemployment, corruption, diminished opportunity impacting large segments of the youth population. Now, this on its own doesn't seem to drive extremism, but what really, really fuels division is when the consequences of this are unevenly distributed. So it's this idea of relative inequality, the idea that elite interests are being served at the expense of everybody else. And again, violent groups tap into these feelings. They offer immediate employment and future opportunity, and they offer a governance model that's based more on equality and meritocracy than what individuals are receiving in their home states. Now, a final situation where an individual will join this extremist group in rejection of something is when their civil rights are being violated and there's no option for redress. And again, we see this playing out in both developing and developed countries. And it's a great example of how not understanding what really drives extremism has led to policies that can be harmful. So security measures, particularly stop and search protocols and immigration vetting, when they disproportionately affect young male Muslims, it makes them feel at war with the state. Okay. So this is the first group of individuals. They're reacting to a set of structural issues that they see as unjust. And it's got to be said that most of the time, their complaints are fairly valid. But there's another group that doesn't seem to be that interested in politics at all. They join a group for highly personal reasons. So some are motivated by economic gain. In Nigeria, material reward seems to be a much bigger motivator than religion for people joining Boko Haram. Another set of recruits are attracted by the prospect of adventure, this idea that fighting alongside an insurgent group will bring excitement or novelty. Another set seek self-cleansing. So this particularly relates to rape victims, those who have engaged in premarital sex or who identify as gay or lesbian. So discrimination towards these groups tends to, in some cases, drive them towards a religious conservatism with a view to self-correction or forgiveness seeking. And a final group seek reward, so social significance, wealth, marriage. This is especially meaningful in Arab cultures where provision is highly associated with adulthood and masculinity. And again, propaganda has played an important role. So not only do these extremist groups promise to deliver the goods that recruits long to possess, they also construct this narrative of heroism, this idea that they are the winning team and you should be on it. Okay, so they're the structural motivators, feeling aggrieved or wanting something badly enough. These people want to join an extremist group, but they need one to join and they need one that will accept them. And this is one way in which Daesh was very different from movements we've seen in the past. They take anyone and they make it easy. They've set up sophisticated enablers. The first enabler is peer networks. Some really interesting research just released in Belgium suggests that more than 75% of Daesh fighters from that country were recruited through friendship groups. It's really not the internet. It does play a role, but very few people are recruited solely online. Others just follow the group that they already belong to. They're members of one violent group, a gang, for example, who switched its alliance and shifted to a different geographic context. And then others lack a group to belong to, and they find one in this world of violent extremism. Now, there's a whole psychology behind this, and you can read about it more in the report, but in a nutshell, the idea is that when adolescents take on an independent identity, they look for cues and patterns around them. Usually there are many sub-identities on offer, the university student, the worker, the young spouse. But if these opportunities aren't available, groups like Daesh can become really attractive alternatives. Okay, so before anyone asks, where does religion fit into all of this? It obviously plays a huge role, and certainly there are some who are motivated solely by a sense of religious obligation. But for most, religion also serves the role of an enabler. Whether they're reacting to grievance or seeking social significance or pursuing a reward, individuals need a framework within which to act out their frustrations. And religious ideology provides just this. Jihad as a modality to right the wrongs committed against Sunnis or reject the state. It's an equally appealing narrative for those seeking reward or salvation. So some experts think that this is why Daesh was just so effective. The religious ideology it presented was so malleable. It offered something for everyone. And it attracted recruits from the West, from local populations, right through to other terrorist groups. It also explains why violent radicals are not usually that pious. Okay, so in short, while religion and religious actors do play a big role in some cases, their influence isn't always causative. It's most often facilitative. It provides this justification for ends-oriented violence. Okay, so I think we're going to stop for, I'm going to hand back over to Kristen, and we're going to talk about the poll and answer any questions. I'm going to look if there's any questions from here. And Kristen.
Okay. I can hear you muted. Thank you so much for that initial part, Erica. And as you say, it really is, it's so important that we're able to have in such a concise moment a breakdown of this degree of complexity that your research has been referring to. So in terms of the poll, and really the audience now is coming in with answers in terms of what types of PVE programs has anyone been engaged with. So I can see that a majority, or it's about equal, between children in conflict with the law and provision of legal counselling. The other half, quite significant amount, is at none, actually. So about half of the people on the webinar today have not been involved in any types of PVE programs. Yes, it is an opportunity. I haven't seen really any questions come up in the chat box, but we will be pausing as well on 2 other occasions during the Erica's presentation to address questions. So if you do have any questions related to Erica's presentation, please don't hesitate to type into the chat box. I see that Judith is asking if we had anyone from Albania or Kosovo. I think that may also be because Taldazom has been involved in a project there in terms of preventing violent extremism through community engagement. So it could be always interesting to also hear from your experiences as well. But okay, so there's one question now maybe that I'll put to Erica, which is from Simona. Are there specific reasons why youth, I think that's supposed to be youth, engage in violent extremism compared to adults?
Mute my mic. Yeah, it's a good question. I touched on it briefly, and we do look. The evidence is that these have always been youth moments, and that there's no real clear evidence on why, as a blanket reason. But again, what we think is that youth just seem to be in this very special point in their lives. They're not invested in the same way as adults are in terms of asset accumulation, career trajectory, family. They have agency, and again, they have the most to gain. Like, most people aren't joining these groups because they're intent on killing people. They believe in what they're doing, and they believe in the social changes that they're arguing for. So they have the most to gain. They're the ones who are going to benefit if they get the changes that they're advocating for. We think that this probably explains the disproportionate participation of people between 18 and 25. And again, this is not just Daesh. All the radical movements that have, come before it over hundreds of years, again, we're seeing this group as being the main participants.
All right, that's good. So I think that those are probably the final parts of the poll. So Erica, I can hand over to you again. Oh,
I'm not muted. Okay. All right. So I just covered quite a bit of complicated information. So if anyone got lost, the takeaway is that there are many pathways into violent extremism. As complicated as it might be, it seems that it's structural or individual drivers coupled with exposure to an extremist group and its ideology and its group support that's behind the making of an extremist. And as I said, this is really problematic from a security and programming perspective. It would be much easier if there was a few causal drivers that we could just nip in the bud. And what's even more complicating is that these structural deficits, they've got no easy fixes. So Sunni marginalisation, youth lack of opportunity, weak governance, these are all chronic and complicated development challenges. But understanding this complexity, it's a prerequisite to devising solutions that can better protect at-risk groups. And the reverse is also true. So not understanding this complexity, it gives way to programs that are either ineffective or can make the situation worse. We only have to look at some of the policies introduced in recent years by the West and its allies to see this. I'm not making this point to be critical, but we also must accept that Daesh isn't on the news every night anymore because the West won the ideological battle. What won was military prowess. And it's precisely because this ideological battle is still in play that we need to look at the deficits in our response and use this to get to better entry points. Okay, so looking at what was done to counteract the Daesh threat at the state level, the trend has strongly favoured expanding the powers and reach of the security sector. I'll mention just 5, and it's critical to keep in mind that laws on terrorism and violent extremism, they rarely set out special provisions for children or youth. Okay, so we've got things like legislation that greatly widens the definition of terrorism. So in France, it's in France, it's a crime to even plan to join a terrorist organisation. Elaborated powers of arrest and pretrial detention for matters involving national security. For the lawyers among us, it's up to 14 days in some countries now, and this is really unprecedented. Third, I've got wider scope for intelligence gathering with and without judicial oversight. Legislation that revokes the citizenship of people engaged in terrorist activity, and control of communications, of course, what someone says on the internet, for example. Okay, now to some people, this mightn't seem all that bad. I mean, certainly as a parent, I would gladly give away a bit of my privacy if it meant that somebody was making sure that my teenage daughter wasn't being groomed over the internet. And certainly these stricter security measures have received broad popular support. But it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how the risk has also widened for due process breaches and gross miscarriages of justice. To take an example from my own country, the Australian Citizenship Amendment Act that's just been passed, it allows authorities to revoke the citizenship of dual nationals as young as 14 for terrorist acts committed abroad, even if they haven't been convicted of a crime in state. But this goes beyond the rule of law. These measures have provoked extensive fear and hostility. So when laws encroach on privacy or freedom of speech or target a particular group, perceptions of marginalisation are exacerbated. And remember, it's these feelings of marginalisation, being at war with the state, basic social injustice. We now know that this is what is driving someone to take their radical ideas and give them a home somewhere like Daesh. Securitization has also disempowered key actors at the community level, the ones who should be our front line in the fight against extremism. So to the extent that religious CBOs and NGOs are now compelled by law to report information on individuals, they lose trust and reach in terms of their clientele. We've heard from teachers and imams that they no longer feel comfortable discussing or answering questions on radicalisation because it leaves them vulnerable to questioning by intelligence authorities. So that's at the policy level. If we turn to soft space PVE programming, the type of stuff your organisations might be engaged in, the results have been equally mixed. And again, it's not lack of competence, it's usually misunderstanding around what drives extremism. I'll talk through just a few. A principal entry point has been messaging. 2 years ago, if you needed funding, all you had to do was propose a project developing counter narratives based around Islam. But this has been really problematic in practice because it assumes that ideology is the principal driver of extremism. But as we talked about, While this may be correct in a small number of cases, ideology is generally an enabler. So focusing on religious narratives, it's not only pretty ineffective, but it also strikes many as disingenuous that policymakers are invoking religion to deal with a problem that's rooted in poor governance and elite capture. Other interventions like awareness raising and skills building have sometimes inappropriately targeted youth, particularly Muslim youth. So as part of this research with TEDism, we examined the targeting criteria used in donor programs and country strategies. Basically how CBOs and teachers and people like this are supposed to identify budding extremists. And it's things like searching for role models, introspection, detachment from authority, emergent political interest, exercising self-expression. Now, I'm sure everyone would agree that this basically describes every teenager on the planet. And if we then add, and again, I'm taking this directly from vulnerability assessment frameworks, characteristics like feeling discrimination or grievance, regularly visiting mosques or engaging in prayer, obviously we end up targeting Muslim youth as our beneficiaries. The consequences scarcely need spelling out. We have well-intentioned programs that are instead driving existing perceptions of marginalisation and exclusion. And we don't even need to be experts in extremism. We know from the youth engagement scholarship that when an individual feels targeted, their vulnerability to recruitment into that suspect group, whether it's a gang or a drug ring or an extremist group, it increases, usually as a means of securing protection. And I think we're going to another poll now. And I'm going to mute and hand over to.
That's great, Erica. And while we leave that poll up there in terms of what are the areas where additional tools and guidance would be useful, so we're keen to hear from the audience about that. I just wanted to pick up on a few questions that have been put to you in the chat box. So the first question comes from Ilaria Verati, who's asking, could you add something more in terms of the actors' networks, in terms of listing or identifying the most important actors and how to engage with each actor or stakeholder? So that was Ilaria's question.
So we're getting to that. Kristen, is this a good? Should I just plug on if there's no other questions?
There was one more question actually. So I'll put the second question to you in understanding that you'll end up answering Ilaria's question a bit later on. So the second question from Guillermo Tafini, who is in Kabul, Guillermo says, Erica, you said that recruitment never happened solely through the web. So do you mean that the Daesh or other terrorist organizations have a well-connected structure throughout Europe? If so, do you think such structure is organized hierarchically and that all cells are connected? Thank you, Guillermo, for that question.
Oh, goodness. Okay, complex question. Okay, we have some outlier cases where recruitment has solely happened online, but they are the outliers. We're really not seeing that. Usually you need someone in play, and we're seeing peer networks that in some cases, but certainly not always, involve mosques or religious leaders. Yes, they are in Europe. This is how people got there. These 30,000, 40,000 people did not go from Europe into the Middle East solely on the internet. I would say, I think most experts would agree that upwards of 80% were being recruited through peer networks. Yes, they are in place. Yes, they're connected. I'm not a terrorism expert, so I couldn't say to the extent that there's group interconnections or interconnections within cell groups, but certainly they are active. They haven't disappeared. What most people think is that they've gone underground. But yes, they do exist. They existed for a long time. They're going to continue to exist. in the
All
future.
right, thanks for that, Guillermo. And then just to reflect on the poll, and thanks for your response, Erica and Guillermo. I can see you're keen to have some more questions, but maybe these are also things that we can continue discussing on other opportunities as well. In terms of the poll, so it's very interesting actually. Across the participants, it's quite an even spread. Actually, the slight majority of people, a third, are saying that they would find additional guidance in messaging and narrative to be the most useful, whereas just a bit less than that we have in terms of risk assessment or M&E, and then the least useful is seen to be identifying and mapping out entry points, which is actually quite interesting, and maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to hand back to Erica to see what's
Yeah, I think just adding to that, Kristen, I think it also indicates that there's broad need for additional tools. Like they're very well rounded across the different elements of programming. But okay, so back to what now? Okay, so I guess the question is, what do we do to flip this around? What changes if we think about violent extremism as the product of structural drivers, individual motivators, and enablers? And how do we get over this fact that the structural drivers are rooted in chronic politico-development challenges that have no simple or quick solutions? Now, what we put forward in the paper is that we need to get closer inside the minds of vulnerable individuals. If we look back at how I've described this journey into violent extremism, something that should be clear is that these people are not being brainwashed or coerced. They're exercising agency in rejection of marginalisation or other grievances, but mostly jobs or education. They leave family obligations. They pay money to go. And preventing people from exercising this agency is fraught with difficulty. Modern recruitment networks are very difficult to quash. And to the extent that people want to join a fight, groups will find ways to enable them. So if the decision to join a violent extremist group is the result of a kind of cost-benefit analysis, we need to think how that assessment might be adjusted in favour of non-violent options. And so then the question becomes so much easier. What kind of environment do youth need in order to reject extremist groups? This is the one question that should be at the top of everyone's agenda. Okay, so I'm going to end by offering up 3 areas of youth engagement that might serve as a framework for bolstering resilience against extremist engagement. Okay, so in the report, we do talk about livelihoods and employment. And while this isn't an easy fix, it does give us some clues. We need to remember that employment isn't just about income. Those avenues provide connectedness and direction and social capital and just relief from boredom. So ways to deliver these kinds of opportunities that are not employment, such as sports and extracurricular activities, they've been largely unexplored and they're often discounted as just too peripheral to contribute to PPE. But people involved in youth programming, they know that these activities allow youth to develop really important competencies that help them cope with difficult life experiences. There's particularly strong empirical evidence that sport, especially competitive team sports, forge skills in cooperation and responsibility and self-control and commitment. And extracurricular activities, they tend to have equally positive outcomes. They promote initiative, they give people skills in time management and problem solving, and they provide social connections outside of existing peer networks. And these can sometimes compensate or at least offset deficits in opportunity and participatory governance. Okay, second thing, as I've mentioned a few times, something we've only worked out pretty recently is that radical ideology is far more widespread than we ever thought. We've also worked out that even if radical thinking could be prevented or programmed away, which is highly unlikely, it probably wouldn't be effective in curtailing violent extremism because the connection is just too tenuous. The more tangible connection is probably between radical ideology, marginalization, and extremism. And as we've discussed, those holding radical beliefs can have their perceptions reinforced if they feel targeted through so-called prevention programs or if they feel discriminated against. So in other words, most radicals don't become violent extremists, but they're more likely to if they feel scapegoated or isolated because of their ideology. Okay, so this lesson about not inadvertently pushing radicals into extremism obviously needs to be heeded in terms of new legislation and how we design programs. But we should probably aim higher than just not alienating people. Societies need to be sufficiently inclusive that those harboring radical views feel that they have a safe space to exist, but with clear red lines. They also need space to play out their grievances. Coming back to this idea that joining a group is a result of a cost-benefit analysis, and this analysis needs to be adjusted in favour of non-extremist options. This suggests that we need to offer alternate pathways for would-be fighters to constructively but non-violently address their concerns. So entry points like public discussion and debate, opportunities to engage in peaceful protest, civic action, community service, they all may prove cathartic and constructive. So a final entry point is to give youth tools to make these better non-violent choices. What's clear from the success of Daesh messaging and the non-success of counter messaging is that youth don't want to be persuaded. They need to be informed. But particularly in the Middle East, youth lack skills in critical thinking, constructive debate, and analysis. And building these skills requires curricular reform, but it can also be taught outside the classroom. But this only works if there are safe spaces to discuss issues of extremism and politics and recruitment. So this trend where teachers and community leaders and imams avoid having these discussions because they fear being targeted by intelligence authorities, this is an obvious bottleneck that needs to be removed. But if youth have the tools and the places to critically engage with the messaging and the propaganda around them, the options skyrocket. So this is something we've really got to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm coming. Oh, there's another poll. Hang on. Oh, let me just sum up. I'm coming to the end of the time, and I do want to leave space for questions. I've just mentioned 3 areas of engagement that are scantily talked about, but might respond better to the actual drivers of violent extremism. No one is suggesting that these are panacea, but the challenges are relatively few. So sports, extracurricular, public debate, peaceful protest, critical thinking, these are all low-cost initiatives. They're not political, and they're easier to roll out at scale. And we do need to start thinking about this for 3 main reasons. The first thing is that the security frameworks and the laws that were set up over the past few years to stop recruitment and terrorist attacks, they haven't gone away. So to the extent that they're still compromising due process or driving feelings of marginalization, they're still pushing would-be extremists along their way. A second reason is that there's still a lot that we don't understand, especially around rehabilitation and reintegration of extremists and how best to care for children that may have been caught up in or taken into a violent group. And a final reason we need to be thinking about this, and I hope it's obvious now, is that Daesh may have suffered a military setback, but because the drivers are still there, this shouldn't be considered a win. It's breathing space. Undoubtedly, they're seeking to strengthen and re-emerge, and if I'm wrong and they're not, it's just going to be a different group. This is what history tells us. So again, what we have now is a pause. It's a short period of time to reflect and to critically evaluate how we understand extremism and how to craft programs and policies that are going to build resilience in children and young people who are going to need it most. So let me just leave it there. That was all I really wanted to say in this presentation, and thank you for listening. And I'm going to go back to this poll. I'm going to hand over to Kristen, and then we're going to dedicate any more time we have.
All right, thank you, Erica. I'm just going to pop my video on just to make it a little bit more interactive. So thank you so much for this very thorough and insightful, but also very succinct presentation of a very complex topic. And I think that just on your last point, I really take that as a call to action for all of us in communities of practice of child protection across the world to not be lulled into a false sense of security by the fact that we maybe are not seeing information about Daesh on the media, as you say, on the 8 o'clock news every night. So really we should be taking advantage of this moment to be able to, as you say, to be able to reflect and to be able to move forward in terms of developing evidence-based programming that responds to the real needs. So in terms of, we've got 2 polls here, very lots of activity. So I'm just going to the poll number 5 here, which is on the left of the screen, is asking what challenges have you faced in developing and implementing PVE programs? So the majority of people are saying that they actually don't know enough about how to navigate in this area, which is actually, it refers back to one of the earlier polls for saying that actually a lot of the audience currently aren't engaging in any activities around PVE. So that would correlate. And then the poll number 6 around what are the areas where additional tools and guidance would be useful. We also had that up before, which is again quite a divided across the audience. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to raise a few questions that came up in the last section, Erica, when you were speaking. The first question comes from Laura Jacques, who's one of our in one of our teams in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. So she actually, her question is quite a long question, but essentially she's saying that she's asking, should we be focusing on primary prevention programs, which is targeting the general public, or more secondary prevention, which is targeting radical groups? I suppose she's also referring to your points with regard to the ineffectiveness or sometimes counterproductiveness of particular programs that actually target quote unquote radical groups and further stigmatize and further marginalize them. So maybe Laura, some of the finishing points that Erica mentioned were in some ways responding to that with the evidence from youth policy making and engagement in broad-based activities. But Erica, was there any other? Would you like to add anything else with respect to that?
I think evidentially the most important thing, I can put my video back in. There we go. I wasn't just staying really still. I think the most important thing is to stop doing things that are inadvertently exacerbating some of the feelings that drive experience. So we've just really got to stop doing those programs. Again, just to reiterate, to the extent that people hold radical views, I think there's strong ethical boundaries, and there's just from a strictly programming and pragmatism point of view, if the volume of these people is so large, targeting those views and opinions is not necessarily the most pragmatic way forward. I think most of the evidence shows that giving people off-ramps. I'll just give you an example. We don't have a lot of returnees that have been able to be interviewed, but from the small number that have come back and they have the research value of these subjects has been shared more broadly. It appears that these people were frustrated and they tried many different avenues before they resorted to actually going to Syria or Iraq and joining a violent group. So they might have tried some sort of civic action, they might have tried volunteerism, and it just didn't work. They couldn't get anywhere. So it seemed that they did go through a hierarchy of problem-solving fora before they got to that endpoint. And again, just to reiterate that that this is an exercising of agency. People, it's quite complicated still to to be able to physically get there, particularly in the last few years of Daesh. Security around borders and being able to fly in there, it got much difficult to do. So people really had to go to great lengths to enter the theatre, but they did. So giving them better options, non-violent options, but are still constructive, and keeping in mind that a lot of the grievances that are driving this are legitimate. I think that's another really important element of this. So off ramps, legitimacy of some of the disgruntled attitudes. I think this is kind of where we need to be putting most of our thought and programmatic.
I'm afraid, Kristen, that we do not hear you. At least I do not hear you, and I see in the chat box that others do not hear you as well.
Okay, that's because I put my video on, but I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Judith, for mentioning that. Okay, so I'll just quickly go through those two questions. One by Miriama, which is, do you have good examples of where states have managed to engage youth in critical thinking around PVE? And the second by Igor, who asks, are we aware of effective PVE interventions by Islamic religious leaders or scholars? Thank you both.
Okay, can we hear me? Okay. I think for the first question on states engaging youth in critical thinking, I think that the best examples come from within the youth scholarship itself. So there are loads of agencies, TEDism, other agencies with child protection mandates that have been involved in these types of skills building programs. I don't think we have to look for states or state-led examples of where this can be done well or done seriously. I think the best lessons they exist already, and we can take them from the existing scholarship on youth engagement and child engagement. Secondly, religious actors. Sure, I mean, and religious actors have been engaged to varying extents in varying country contexts. Again, I would suggest that, well, in my experience, there's been quite a bit of pushback from the religious community, basically saying, don't get me to fix a problem that you created, governments, because this isn't about religion. This is about whether it's youth opportunity or marginalization or corruption or geopolitics in the region. This is the problem that they're complaining about. So don't get religion. Religion is not going to fix this. And I think that's a very, very legitimate point that needs to be taken in. And to the extent that religious leaders have perhaps felt that their agendas have been hijacked into being new legislation in some areas that has led to, whether it's securitization of mosques, compulsory reporting on individuals, this has really disempowered them and prompted them to disengage from the debate. And that's not what we want. We want them to be able to be talking about this. We want them to feel that they're empowered actors and they're respected actors in their field. But a lot of the religious leaders or religious actors that we've been working with, they feel that their role is better not as an agent of the state in this fight, but as a more neutral, legitimate actor that works alongside, but without
Yeah, that does make sense. And maybe because we only have 2 minutes left and we want to keep to our timing, but maybe just bring in one last question from Maxime, who's joining us from Amman. And he's asking, is there any, as part of PV programming, global or national advocacy towards decision makers advocating for more youth inclusive societies? And in terms of our governments buying into this as a viable solution or way forward. So if you're aware of anything in that regard, Erica.
I think that's something that this is it's definitely not something that I can answer in 2 minutes. Yes, there's some interesting work going on and I think there will be a facility to share additional links, and certainly we do mention some in the report. I think just one important thing to mention, it, especially when we're talking about safe spaces to engage around or discuss issues of violence and instilling in youth, types of skills that they need to critically evaluate propaganda, maybe having safe spaces for dissent. There is a political angle here that, particularly in the Middle East, states may not want an empowered youth population, and what we're proposing is that the reins there are lessened a little bit. So there is a bit of a tension there, but social contracts throughout the region are kind of struggling at the moment, and there might be a space opening up where governments are looking for ways to engage youth in a way that will not stop things spilling over into violence, but giving just enough to diffuse, to give them off-ramps. That space may be now. So we might be seeing before, unlike ever before, we might be seeing governments that are more open to some of these arguments around giving the youth population a little bit of a wider space to engage. If it's a question between extremism, which they are very scared of, or spillovers into conflict, which they are also very scared of, they may see themselves between a rock and a hard place, but it may be going more towards the side where they'll.
Thank you so much, Erica. Thank you so much for that, and finishing on actually such a positive note, really a note of there is an opportunity, there is a possibility to really start to go beyond anything that we as a community practice have done before, engaging with states. There is obviously, about a year ago in December last year, there was a Security Council resolution that actually, explicitly requested that states be more active in involving, in looking at the impacts of their counter-terror policies on children. And so maybe it is that there is more opportunities opening up in terms of engaging with states and in terms of, advocating for them to be listening, at least be listening to maybe some more of these critical approaches. So thank you so much. Thank you for that, Erica. And thank you for everyone who's attended today. As you'll be able to know, the report that Erica has written and has referred to throughout this presentation is available to download through the same website that is on the Child Hub. The recording of this will also be available on that same link. So if you have anyone who wasn't able to make it today, please let them know that they can listen to the recording. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact myself, and we'll hopefully be taking this discussion forward. Thank you all again. I hand over to Judith just to finalize the call.
Thank you very much to both of you. Excellent presentation and facilitation. Kristen, thank you very much. And also I'm very happy to see so many people have come online to join us today. I just want to point out that we have one more webinar coming up on December 12th when we talk about trafficking in the migration context. And it's always my pleasure to remind people to please subscribe to our newsletter so that you can remain updated on what we are doing, what are our upcoming events. I also feel that maybe there is room for a second webinar on this subject where you can go into more detail into some of the things like how you work with youth in prevention. But yeah, let's see what the future holds, and hopefully we can meet again in similar circles. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.